Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this month's Skills Academy for Wales. Today we're joined by Lloyd Richards and Ben O'Hickley, who will be providing an introduction to biodiversity. I think you're all muted, but if you aren't, can I just ask you to mute yourselves so there's no distractions for the presenter? There'll be an opportunity to ask questions throughout the session or at the end of the presentation using the chat function. The webinar is being recorded and the slides in the recording will be uploaded to the SharePoint and the Teams site after the session. Please let me know if you don't have access to these channels and I can grant you access.
My name is Lloyd Richards. I'm an ecologist, obviously at WSP, based in the Cardiff office, and I specialise in biodiversity and ecology assessments.
Hi everyone, I'm Ben O'Hickley. I'm a senior consultant in WSP's natural capital team. So we sit within our ecology discipline, but focus more on natural capital assessments, ecosystem services assessments, and trying to support clients in mapping and understanding natural assets and how to manage them.
Right, okie doke. Let's get cracking. Effectively, this presentation, this webinar, will effectively outline some of the approaches that we can take in Wales to, I suppose, create a measurably greener development and ultimately a greener Wales. We'll touch on some of the methods that we can use that should be and can be integrated as part of developments in Wales. Okie doke. So just a number of agenda items here. First of all, just to set the context with regards to what biodiversity is, most of you will already know that anyway, but just a refresher. Biodiversity and its place in Wales with regards to the legislation and policy landscape, how we can measure the value of biodiversity and deliver net benefits in Wales, and how nature-based solutions and natural resources can be used as part of development. We'll also explore what we've done at WSP through case studies, and finally, how this approach creates a greener future in Wales. Okay, so most of you already know what biodiversity is, but for those of you that don't, it's effectively all the different kinds of life you'll find in one area, the variety of animals, plants, fungi, and even microorganisms like bacteria. Effectively, what they do is work together in ecosystems which form an intricate network. And they are the sort of life, I suppose the cornerstones really, in maintaining balance, functioning and supporting life. I suppose it goes without saying, why is biodiversity important? Well, it's the life support that's, it's life support that we as humans depend on, both materials, medicine, etc. Okay, so again, a lot of you will already know the legal and policy landscape in Wales with regards to how biodiversity is safeguarded. But in case you don't, here's a refresher. Two strong pieces of legislation in Wales at the moment, which are the Environment Wales Act and the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Both of them effectively tackle sustainable management of natural resources and how we can build natural resources into our developments and build resilient ecosystems in order to achieve long-term sustainability at both the national and a local level. The one good thing, well, not one good thing, but a really good part of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, for those of you who aren't overly aware, is that it introduces 7 wellbeing goals, which include resilient ecosystems and a prosperous Wales. And what the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act does, it promotes and implements sustainable development, and hopefully allows generations beyond ourselves to have the same quality of life as we do now. Goes without saying that the Planning Policy Wales is the backbone to planning and development in Wales. Doesn't really need any further introduction. It's quite simply our national policy that outlines required guidance against which our planning applications are determined in Wales. We've also got the Natural Resources Policy, which is a group of policies born out of the Environment Act, the Environment Wales Act, which sets out the priorities, risks and opportunities for managing natural resources sustainably. The Natural Resources Policy takes into account the findings of the State of Natural Resources Report, and it contributes, rather importantly, to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act's 7 wellbeing goals. It also prioritises the nature-based solution and supports people and places by taking a place-based approach. We've also got in Wales, we've also got a number of strategic documents and other documents of importance that I suppose accompany both legislation and policy and are important in shaping biodiversity and our natural resources going forward. So that's a brief sort of introduction on the legislation policy, which most of you already know anyway. So the question is, can biodiversity be valued? Well, yes, it can. Traditionally, biodiversity has been valued through obtaining field data such as standard habitat mapping and protected and notable species assessments, which of course give us an understanding of how much value the habitats have and how biodiverse it is. Ordinarily, as part of any field data collection, we should be obtaining condition assessments of the habitats to understand its form and functioning and its structure. That then can give us an understanding of if it's in a favourable conservation status or not. That will then provide information as to how valuable the biodiversity is. We've also got bioindicators, which are key to understanding the health of an ecosystem, things like dormice, dippers, salmonids, etc. We can quantitatively value biodiversity as well through the use of toolkits, and I'll come on to that on the next few slides. And of course, guidance within local planning authorities across Wales are also key in understanding the value of biodiversity. Things like the historical biodiversity action plans, everything through local planning authorities to national parks, and of course existing biodiversity records. So that's a snapshot really of how biodiversity can be valued. But another question is, why do we need to know its value as part of development? Well, go to that saying really that development over the past 4 to 5 decades has led to the decline in biodiverse environments, loss of species abundance and local extinctions on both local and national level. And for those of you who've read the State Natural Resource Report, it indicates that currently none of Wales's ecosystems are showing all the attributes of the resilience that are needed to maintain ecosystems. So understanding that value from the onset, the value of biodiversity, it can pave the way for an appropriately designed and sustainable development, of course with the aim of protecting valuable habitats that support these declining species, whilst also increasing the resilience of the natural environment and restoring degraded habitats or enhancement of low valued habitats. Then this allows for efficient utilization of our natural resources, so things like sustainable drainage, carbon storage, etc. Taking all of that into account, this then puts the development into a prime position to comply with the key pieces of legislation discussed earlier, and ultimately delivering what's called a net benefit for biodiversity and also for people. Net benefit, for those of you who aren't familiar with the phrase net benefit, what is it? What does it look like at a glance? Effectively, the phrase net benefit is derived from Section 6 of Planning Policy Wales and is the policy response to the Environment Wales Act and the Section 6 duty. Effectively, a net benefit is delivering an overall measurable gain comparative to the current baseline. Basically means improving our environment as part of development so that our valued habitats are retained, our less valuable habitats are enhanced, and our communities are able to thrive in the benefits. So I suppose from an illustrative perspective, there's a schematic on screen which effectively indicates ultimately what a net benefit is, but also indicates what a net loss and a no net loss would look like. Touching on the strategic document that I referred to earlier, so a chap called Neil Hemington, Chief Planner, he produced a letter back end of 2019 with regards to net benefit, and effectively what Neil indicates is that a net benefit for biodiversity can be secured through habitat creation, long-term management arrangements to enhance existing habitats. It's important to note here that any enhancement would effectively take the baseline into a better state than before, providing that the enhancement, of course, contributes to an overall positive net change in biodiversity. It also includes building in greater resilience to our ecosystems. So, assessing biodiversity change to understand the net benefit of a development. It's worth pointing out here that for those of you who have worked within England or on projects within England, you'll be familiar with the term biodiversity net gain. Now, this assessment of biodiversity change is, I suppose, akin to biodiversity net gain in England, but of course we're in Wales, and biodiversity net gain doesn't strictly apply the way it does in England. With that said, we do have powerful legislation that's been in place far long before England's Environment Act. So, how do we understand the net benefit of development? How can we put this into practice, and how can we measure it? So there are lots of great things happening in Wales at the moment, from sustainable drainage. We have an impeccable sustainable drainage approach. We're creating new species-rich meadows and woodlands for carbon storage, and also there's a greater uptake of renewable energy developments also, including restoration of peat bogs. For the most part, and particularly as part of development proposals, where the consideration of biodiversity is concerned, this is happening primarily on a qualitative level. And while that's great, to truly understand the net change and the benefit a development delivers, the qualitative element should be supported by a quantitative measure. One way of doing this is by utilizing an accounting tool to measure what's being done as part of a development. The most widely used tool in biodiversity accounting and offsetting at the moment is the Biodiversity Metric, developed by Natural England, which uses habitat as a proxy for biodiversity. Again, for those of you who've worked in England will know how this tool operates. It's a great way of numerically illustrating the landscape before development and after development, and not only includes naturally occurring habitats, but green infrastructure and other habitats designed as part of the built environment. It's not just a tool for England, despite it being developed by Natural England. It uses habitats that are found throughout the United Kingdom, so it can be used in Scotland, Wales, England, Ireland, and effectively, as the schematic shows on screen here, what it does, it takes information gathered in the field based on size and biodiversity quality, and it generates baseline value in units, biodiversity value in units. Then the engineering, landscape, and biodiversity design of a development is then added into the tool, into the metric based on a number of losses and gains as part of the development, including risk factors, and ultimately providing a development output in biodiversity units. Effectively, if a development is more biodiverse than the baseline, once it's constructed, the outcome is a measurable net benefit. So the question really is what we're doing as part of development and as part of planning and projects, is what we're doing measurably enough? And if so, how do we know? And in doing that, using the biodiversity metric is a great way of understanding the quantitative gain to accompany the qualitative element. Now, it's worth noting that in England, there is due to be a threshold that needs to be met as part of policy. We obviously don't have that mandate in Wales. I suppose that's a good thing because it allows local planning authorities and statutory bodies to develop their own biodiversity targets in line with our Environment Act and our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So that can be anything that's positive really, and provides a net benefit. So net benefits for biodiversity are a great thing, obviously, because it supports developing the ecosystem and building resiliency. But a net benefit for biodiversity is not just about habitat gains, which I've touched on with that toolkit, the biodiversity metric. It's also about ecosystem gains. The Environment Act and the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, as I've said, is based upon sustainable development of natural resources. Biodiversity, of course, being the foundation. So creating a greener future for whales not only focuses on the enhancement of existing and creation of new habitats, but utilising ecosystems and the available natural resources in a variety of ways to develop more sustainably to deliver benefits for both biodiversity and humankind. This is where the ecosystem approach unfolds, and this is where the natural resources come into play and benefit developments. I'll hand over to Ben now, who will talk about natural resources and natural capital.
Brilliant, thank you, Lloyd. So yeah, building on what Lloyd said, if we are trying to take into account measurable gains in biodiversity, then that really leads us on to trying to understand what other measurable gains can be incorporated within that. And the context around this is very similar to biodiversity net gain in the sense that in England, there's a lot of very specific legislation coming in, and the terminologies used are slightly different. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't drivers within policy within Wales, albeit under slightly different names and titles, to incorporate these kind of things. So when we talk about using an ecosystem approach, we're talking about an extension of looking at measuring biodiversity, and what we're trying to say here is that we shouldn't just stop at the number of species present or the area and the quantity of habitats that occur there, but we should try and understand the more holistic nature of the natural world and the processes that are part of that. And when we do this, we try and break it down nature, which is a very hard thing to quantify, often into the phrase used here as assets, but some people dislike that phraseology because it kind of comes from an accounting process. But we try and break nature down into its component parts. We try and understand what flows of benefits are that is that nature providing, and which component parts of the natural world are providing those benefits. And the phrase used here is ecosystem services, and that can refer to flood protection or reduced risk of flooding from wetlands and natural habitats. It can refer to carbon sequestration from the atmosphere by woodlands, and then more kind of harder to quantify benefits such as recreational and health and well-being benefits from whole green spaces and access to nature. And what we're trying to do is understand that flow, what benefit those stocks are providing, and then trying to value that. Now, whether that doesn't necessarily mean with a pound sign, but what we're talking about there is trying to get an understanding of the benefit that's provided, whether that's quantitative in terms of the tons of carbon sequestered, or a monetary valuation in terms of visitor numbers, or willingness to pay in terms of green space. So building on we're really trying to capture those wider environmental benefits as part of any project or as part of an existing area. Next slide, please, Lloyd. So why is this useful? And I think I probably touched on that a bit, but it provides a common framework, and a lot of these reasons are similar to why we look to use something like a biodiversity metric or measure benefits and measure changes in biodiversity. So yeah, it provides a common framework, allows us to choose between different options or different projects and different solutions to issues that are being faced. It allows for more comprehensive cost benefit analysis. So if we do get an understanding of how much benefit is an area providing in terms of the flood protection and carbon sequestration, it gives us a much more easily quantifiable way to compare that with a built solution or with something different to business as usual. It really allows more innovative policy solutions due to the nature of the fact that you're bringing in lots of different strands and you're pulling together different topics and disciplines, and it helps kind of identify priorities for investment. And the diagram on the left here kind of shows that in the ecosystem service approach, we're trying to take into account the assets which are there, including quantity, quality, and its location. But we're also trying to understand the pressures and the drivers of change. We're trying to understand what ecosystems are delivered, and ultimately it's around trying to maximize the benefits provided by an ecosystem. Next slide, please, Lloyd. And then, so I guess the question is, how do you do that? And a phrase that is becoming more and more popular and utilized is environmental net gain. And really, when we talk about environmental net gain, we're just building on biodiversity net gain and saying that not only do we want to increase the measurable quantity of biodiversity within a site, but we also want to increase the amount of benefits provided. And these can be tailored to specific projects or encompassing as many ecosystem services as we can measure. So we're saying that not only do we want a site to have more habitats, but we want it to be able to provide more in terms of recreational, in terms of health and well-being benefits. We want to ensure that we're not undermining the amount of risk, flood risk protection that it provides. So yeah, trying to encompass wider sustainable issues within our assessments. And so really, this is a natural stepping stone from biodiversity net gain, which I think is kind of the core fundamental part of all of these new sustainability policies. And so if we start with biodiversity net gain, we then need to add in a wider consideration of the natural capital stocks, so kind of not just habitats, but what else is there in terms of the natural world. And then we need to understand whether there's a change in pressures or drivers of change as a result of the development. So it's really kind of a stepping stone, and once we've made the decision to consider biodiversity, it's kind of a nice natural progression. Next slide, please, Lloyd. And yeah, really what this kind of sums up the questions quite nicely. So when we're looking at biodiversity net gain, we're asking ourselves what are the impacts on habitat change for wildlife, and that's probably a very English-centric question, but the point still stands. Moving on, we're then looking at what are the impacts of habitat change for people, and that's kind of where the wider natural capital elements come in. And then that final question, I think what we're really trying to get at here is what are the wider or indirect environmental impacts? And that's really where we have to take into consideration things like stakeholder feedback around how people are using environments or landscapes, take into account socio-economic factors, and historic land uses and livelihoods. So we're really trying to combine wider information sources other than just purely the ecological and the biodiversity based. Next slide, please. And I guess kind of the question is when should you assess these? And the Treasury have a recommendation around the Green Book guidance, but really it revolves around when projects are changing or changing the existing management of land, whether there's likely to be an impact in terms of atmosphere, whether there's an impact on water courses, because those often have much wider environmental impacts than necessarily just the habitats that are present. Whether there's an impact on wildlife, and that's probably looking more at just the biodiversity side of things. Whether there's an impact on raw materials, and when we're considering environmental net gain, things such as timber production and food production kind of fit into that much more easily than potentially other previous assessment systems. And then finally, yeah, is there opportunity for more recreation? And if a project is ticking any of these boxes, it's really a good opportunity to think about whether an ecosystem approach could be used. And so how can we measure these? And luckily we don't have to start from scratch, and also there's a lot more tools and metrics out there than necessarily just the Natural England biodiversity net gain metric as there is for BNG. So at WSP we've helped develop with a number of industry partners a tool called the Nature Tool, and what this does is it takes changes in habitat areas along with some of those other information sources that I mentioned, such as accessibility, nearby population, flood risk, etc., and it provides an assessment over 18 different ecosystem services and gives you an indication of whether the project is likely to cause a positive change or a negative change. And it also gives you an idea of how high the site is scoring against its kind of maximum potential score, and a lot of that will be to do with, for instance, how much accessibility are you allowing, etc. And this is a tool that we developed with industry partners, but there are also lots of other openly accessible tools out there, including ones developed by Natural England and the Environment Agency, but then also kind of university research groups as well. So there's a lot of very good and very specific tools that have been created to support people in having this question of what are the wider environmental impacts of a project. Thanks, Lloyd.
Okay, brilliant. Cheers, Ben. So expanding on the Nature Tool and everything that we've just said, what have we done at WSP? So there's a few projects that we've combined both specific biodiversity assessments and also both biodiversity and ecosystem services into. First one, there's a project that we worked on and rolled out in both the southwest of England and the southwest and southeast of Wales. Effectively, the project's aim was to deliver measurable biodiversity and ecosystem services, ecosystem service enhancements on around 13 sites to enable the client to update their environmental action plan and to meet biodiversity and natural capital requirements. As part of the project, the biodiversity metric was used, and the ecometric test was applied to the site's baseline, habitat baseline, and the new landscaping proposals, and it was developed to see whether it would achieve and deliver increased benefits for both biodiversity and ecosystem services within the client's long-term land assets. We also provided indicative cost based on extensive research from various sources on how much it would cost to create and enhance existing habitat and the costs of habitat management requirements over a 10-year period. We also, expanding on that and more specifically, project for the Welsh Government, optioneering road widening sites. Again, the aim was to deliver a measurable, again, keyword here, measurable, deliver a measurable biodiversity design, which would obtain a net benefit against legislation and policy for biodiversity across 7 road widening sites. Now, as part of this project, we again used the biodiversity metric and applied it to each of the sites' baseline and the landscaping proposals and factored in an outline design for the project or projects to understand which sites could achieve an increase in biodiversity and enhanced biodiversity environment without the need to compensate for any losses as part of the project off-site. As part of the optioneering stage of the project, the assessment was used to demonstrate what would be needed for the sites that were falling short of a measurable net benefit, and then these were presented to the client. Of course, the client was the Welsh Government. I'll hand over to you, Ben.
Yep, thank you, Lloyd. So this was a green infrastructure focused project that we worked on with Ceredigion County Council, and the aim was to undertake a spatial audit of the existing green infrastructure, the habitats that made up them, and the ecosystem services that they were delivering. As part of this, we undertook a stakeholder engagement survey to understand where there were other opportunities for delivering green infrastructure across the county, and then also how stakeholders were engaging with the existing green infrastructure and whether they thought that needed to change or could provide any recommendations for future green infrastructure. And then that was all summarised, so both the spatial information, the quantitative analysis, and the stakeholder engagement into recommendations that could then hopefully be incorporated into the local development plan and allow for not only more green infrastructure development, but kind of green infrastructure that was targeted to stakeholders' needs and kind of requirements as part of the upcoming local plan. And then finally, an example from England, but one that I think is worth sharing is the WSP have been working with Wakefield Council, who are currently looking at how this kind of thing can be funded. So they're interested in developing a district-wide greening finance system. So the idea behind this is that by identifying a number of different funding streams, whether that's companies with corporate social responsibility funds, individuals, donations from individuals, or in environmental land management schemes are operating within Wakefield Council, the council could provide a way of channeling that into a targeted green infrastructure scheme across the whole county. So working with community groups and strategic partners to generate on the ground change that could provide an increase in green infrastructure or natural capital, however you want to call it, that's specifically targeted for the stakeholders within Wakefield and for those that need it most. So as part of this project, the WSP team undertook a review of existing green space within Wakefield, and then also got an understanding of where those deprivation areas were. So if this project does go ahead and Wakefield Council are able to unlock this funding stream for the creation of new green infrastructure, they also have a very specific, a very detailed targeted map of where within Wakefield new development would have the biggest impact.
Okay, so I suppose then, how does this approach help to create a greener future in Wales? So I suppose the fundamentals are really prioritising the protection and enhancement of existing habitats, whilst implementing the creation of new habitats, contributes to the maintenance of healthy ecosystems, and that's the key. What we want to be doing is maintaining healthy ecosystems and building resilience and diversifying them. That ultimately allows us to hold on to nature-based solutions, those natural resources, and allow us to deliver a measurable net benefit for biodiversity. Again, key is measurable net benefit for biodiversity, whilst applying the ecosystem approach, which will allow us to provide cost-effective and efficient ways to transform the challenges we face into opportunities. So carbon storage, water quality improvements, pollution prevention. This will allow natural resources to effectively take the driving seat to grow greener and develop more sustainably, ultimately benefiting Wales as a diverse landscape and a national community. And that's effectively where we end it there. So for those who've got any questions.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Just thinking about the biodiversity metric tool, you talked about part of that process would be doing an initial assessment of if you were looking at, say, if the planning authority was looking at a housing development proposal that had come in, that I'm assuming they would want the developer to have carried out this biodiversity metric, and to be able to do that, I'm guessing that they would need to go out on site and carry out an assessment of what habitat and species are there at the moment. But how many times during the course of a season would you expect that to happen? Because early on in the year, you might get a lot of bird activity when they're nesting, sort of between February, March, April. But a lot of that bird activity then tails off towards the summer, and that those species might disappear into the surrounding countryside, whereas you're not going to see so much butterfly activity, for example, until summer. So how do you make sure that a proposed development, which is carried out an assessment, biodiversity assessment, has made sure that all of the different species of plants and animals that appear at different times of the year have been readily assessed?
It's a good question, Neil. And so this is where I think we're doing it correct in Wales. So what you've just indicated is effectively, I suppose, accompanies the use of the biodiversity metric tool. Now, as I sort of alluded to, the biodiversity metric tool uses habitat as a proxy. It's not a tool that includes information on species, etc. But it uses habitat as a proxy. So what it does need is a competent professional to understand the site, understand the habitats, understand the condition through condition assessments. That information then gets paired with what should have undertaken previously, which would have been a phase 1 habitat survey or a habitat mapping exercise. As part of that, we also need to do an ecological impact assessment. That should be happening, as a standard on all projects. So you've got that information, which is the qualitative element, understanding everything about the site, what is it suitable for, what's present, whether that's undertaken in April or or August, and then that gets paired with the habitats, which are again the proxy for the toolkit. Then those habitats get put into the metric, and the metric uses a number of risk factors. It uses a number of distinctiveness criteria and habitat condition criteria to develop biodiversity units. Again, the biodiversity metric can't work on its own. It's purely for allowing someone to see if you're actually delivering a numerical benefit. So that net change, that's what the toolkit does. You have to pair it with the qualitative element, which of course is ecological impact assessment, understanding how species are using the environment and when they use the environment. And then the assessment effectively indicates, okay, so you've passed the qualitative element. There's a qualitative gain because we know X and Y are there, and we're doing A and B to ensure that that they're being restored. But then you've got the quantitative element, which says, okay, well, X hectares of habitat are being removed, but we're actually delivering, X more hectares of habitat, which also supports, those birds that are nesting earlier on in the season, or those invertebrates that are, using whichever plants at whatever point in the season. So it's effectively a pairing exercise, and the toolkit is used to effectively accompany all the qualitative elements that we should be doing as part of a development, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's the things that feed into that biometric that are the important things.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, effectively, yeah. So I mean, like I said, we're doing, like I said at the beginning, we're doing things in Wales qualitatively right. We're doing it to standards, and everything's being rolled out how it should be. But there's that question that I feel needs to be answered across the whole country as to, is it a measurable net change? And at the moment, I mean, there are a number of different toolkits out there, as Ben has alluded to, but the biodiversity metric takes habitats as proxies, because a habitat as a proxy, because that's where the protected notable species are, that's where the plants are, that's where we also have valuable habitat. So it takes that as a proxy, and it pairs it with everything that we've done as part of the development, which is as standard. So yeah, again, they can't operate individually effectively.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Always.
Okay, we've had a couple more through the chat. Isn't EIA screening exercise the first step?
Yeah, well, exactly, which again, I've obviously alluded to ecological impact assessment. But I mean, some developments may know. I mean, you may have developments that are, which I suppose is adjacent to the whole planning perspective. Some developments could be permitted development, but in any case, understanding what's on your site before we even get to any EIA scoping or EIA screening, understanding what's there on site allows us to design a more sustainable development going forward. Most often we have developments that are sort of chopped down into short windows or short programs, and so having that understanding at the beginning, even before EIA screening or whichever stage, allows us to build in natural resources and a net benefit for biodiversity. I hope that sort of answers the question.
Yeah. Ben, do you want to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to build on what Lloyd said, I think that point of trying to integrate these considerations as early as possible is kind of key to this, and the effectiveness that you can have is really limited when it's you're trying to adjust a detailed design, or a project that's has already gone through a long period of planning and design, and quite often outline business cases when you want to start considering these things, whether or not there's enough detail to provide inputs. These are kind of the questions that we've been discussing today, are kind of what we want to be getting people to asking themselves, whether there's any opportunities, whether there's likely to be more indirect impacts than necessarily might get picked up under normal assessments. And then, yeah, trying to integrate these opportunities throughout project design and throughout kind of the lifespan that happens before, a spade is put in the ground. So I think if EIA screening is a good place to start, but there's also opportunities further down the line during kind of solution development stages and identification where this stuff can really come in.
Sure, that's great. A couple more questions. If a Welsh government agency had a contract with a designer that is totally financially motivated, how would simple measures such as swift bricks, bat boxes in buildings, railway station lift towers, etc. be included? Relatively easy to achieve biodiversity enhancements might grudgingly be seen as an extra.
So, yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one. I mean, with swift boxes and bat boxes and those sort of things, again, touching on using habitat as a proxy for the biodiversity metric, it's all biodiversity enhancements, but again, maybe I'm not fully understanding the question, but it's all about sort of measurable and whether we can confidently say that putting things like that in is a measurable net benefit. I don't know if that answers the question or if you wanted to expand on it, but yeah, I mean, those sorts of things work, but it's just about making sure that is it actually measurable and is it a benefit? Of course, it's a benefit, but is it a net benefit?
Okay, brilliant. John, if that doesn't answer the question, then happy for you to raise your hand. I'll just ask the other question. Should it be enforced or mandatory for all projects and outputs part of the scoring when assessing steps forward and decision making overall?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's becoming, well, it's soon to be in the next couple of years, soon to be mandatory as part of English, the English planning system. Again, it's not part of the Welsh system, or at least the way it is in England. But I think that's because we've got so many other sort of strong, pieces embedded within legislation and policy that understanding, the net change as part of a development is sort of left behind. So personally, I think it should be part and parcel of the planning of a project, and as Ben and I have alluded to right from the beginning, really. And it's also worth noting that again, with biodiversity, as I think Neil alluded to earlier, with regards to changing seasons and whatnot, biodiversity can change. So making sure that we're on top of understanding the site conditions, the habitats, the biodiversity, and the ecosystem services, that will take an iterative approach, and that's just the nature of the beast, really. But yeah, effectively, it should form part of a strategic part of planning and early on.
Thanks both. That was a great presentation.
Brilliant. Thanks for
joining. That's okay. Thanks for having us.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.